Hello everyone. Today we'd like to discuss language and culture instruction in online courses. To get us started, we'd like to introduce ourselves. My name is Kelly Davidson Duvall. I'm an assistant professor at Valdosta State in Georgia in French and foreign language education. I've been teaching online and hybrid classes since about 2011, and I'm part of the Georgia E-Collaborative Development Team, where we are working together with other universities in Georgia to provide online majors for Spanish and French.
Hi, my name is Marie Bertola. I'm currently a lecturer of Italian at Santa Clara University in California. I have master's degree in Italian and French in teaching French as a second language. And I started teaching online and hybrid lab classes in 2002 at college level. A lab course class is half a unit class that it is required to all language students in the elementary sequence, and it is attached to a main 5-unit course.
Thank you, Marie. All right, let's get started with talking about our learning outcomes for this module. So at the end of this module, you should be able to identify some theoretical frameworks for integrating culture into online language instruction. You should be able to start outlining how you might be able to use culture as context and content for an integrated online learning experience. And you should also be able to begin exploring how we can use authentic materials to foster this language and culture integration in our online courses, and perhaps identify how some Web 2.0 resources can be used in your online courses to create conversations about culture using the target language. Finally, we hope that you are able to identify key points of inquiry related to assessment of language and culture learning in an online learning environment. So we have quite a bit to talk about today. I want to start out with our essential question. And for us, that is, how can we most effectively integrate language and culture learning in online courses? And of course, we know that, as Martinez Gibson has said, language is communication, but not without its culture. And that's why we have this as one of the 5 C's. And when we look at the ACTFL standard of cultures, the overall goal is that learners are able to interact with cultural competence and understanding. So what does that mean? How do we break that down for our courses? We can go first to the substandard, where we are talking about relating cultural practices to perspectives. In this case, the learners are using the target language. That's very, very important to investigate, explain, and reflect on the relationship between practices and perspectives. So we see this use of the target language and these higher order thinking skills as integrated into our courses. The second part, or substandard, would be relating cultural products to perspectives, where again, we're asking our learners to use the target language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the relationship between, at this point, products and perspectives. So as we move forward with this, what does this mean for our classrooms? Many of you may be familiar with this Iceberg infographic, where we're talking about products, practices, perspectives, and observable and not observable behaviors of culture. So what this shows us is that the observable behaviors are literally the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about culture. What's not observable are things like interpretations. How do we feel the core values should be reflected in daily life? And from that question, we follow up with, what are those core values? This idea of learned ideas of what is considered good or bad, right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable, desirable or undesirable. And we can also see that within this part that is not observable, we have these formative factors that create and mold those core values, things like economics, family, education, media, history, and religion. So we have a lot of things that are coming together. And when we start to think about incorporating culture into our online courses through language, we see now that that's very, very complex in what we do. One of the most important resources that ACTFL has given us are the Intercultural Communicative Competence Can-Do statements. And these were developed by a task force within ACTFL led by Dr. Jackie Van Houten. And the main idea is that we are trying to get learners to work with the target language to explore cultures. And the learners are active agents in their cultural learning. So we see these three parts where the ICC can-do statements can help us. Showing how language can be learned through a cultural lens, suggesting sample task-based ICC learning goals, and describing scenarios for reflection both in and outside of the classroom. And it's important to note that these are not a curriculum, they're not an assessment, they're not a rubric, but it's a place for us to start conversations about how we integrate language and culture, how we teach culture through language, and also how we can help our learners to become active agents in their education in languages and cultures. So what might this look like in the classroom? Here's one example with transportation, and you can see here that we're talking about proficiency levels. And again, it's not a rubric or a curriculum, but it's something to start our discussion. For the novice, we're accessing simple information, maybe doing some basic description that is appropriate to that level about transportation options based on my location. As we move into intermediate, we see a couple more factors thrown in there. I can choose an appropriate means of transportation based on my local options and my locations, my needs. And then once we get to advanced, we see an emphasis on the perspectives. I can discuss why certain cultures place a priority on environmentally friendly transportation. So we see how we are moving through those proficiency levels, but we're teaching culture through language. So we're teaching them as integrated. One way that we can look at our courses and we can try and guide our students is the framework of perspective transformation. There are others that perhaps you have used in your classrooms. I found this one to be particularly helpful. And how this works is we're looking at the progress of the learner through several steps. So we start out with setting the stage. This is where we're activating those cognitive schemata, we're activating that background knowledge, their previous experiences. And as you can see, the second step is cultural disequilibrium. And so we're experiencing some incongruity in the thinking, whether that is new information or maybe different information from what the student believed to be true, or whether they're making comparisons with their own and the target cultures. Any place where they're experiencing that incongruity is a teachable moment. So we move through the next steps, such as cognitive orientations. They might be overtly reflective or not so much overtly reflective, but they are working through them. And then we see what that means for their learning strategies. How do they take action with this new knowledge? And our ultimate goal is an evolving cultural identity, so a change in perspective based on their learning of language and culture. And so if we're always trying to move towards this evolving cultural identity where our students are learning more and integrating it into their worldview, then we need to build those supports into our online classrooms. It does need to be said that this process is iterative. So a student can maybe get to cognitive orientations and they might cycle back around. They may get all the way to the evolving cultural identity in one area, but they may show slower progress in other areas. So I think it's important for us to remember that students are always as active agents in the classroom working towards different goals in different areas. But if we provide them the supports for that evolving cultural identity and this evolution of their perspective and how they think about cultures, I think that we can really support them in our online courses. So let's take a moment for self-reflection now that we've talked about some of the bigger frameworks. And just think about some of these questions on your own. So pause the video and reflect on your personal philosophy on teaching cultures, what your book or curriculum is. Do you create your own exercises? How do you use the target language to discuss the culture? Do you use authentic materials? Are you the only referent for target cultures for your students? What projects or activities you might incorporate that put students in touch with the target cultures using the target language as described in the standards? And what are some areas of interest that you would like to work on in your own courses? And now that we've talked a little bit about your background, let's begin to start building a plan. So take another moment to pause the video and really think about your courses. Maybe you want to focus on one course and then apply it to other courses. What's the scope of your course? Is it fully online or is it hybrid? Have you taught online before? What elements are synchronous and what are asynchronous? And maybe why have you chosen to have them that way if you're familiar with that? What language level are you teaching, and what are your proficiency target goals for your program? Maria, I believe you would like to talk about backward.
Let's talk about how to create language level activities that integrate cultural perspective and are aligned with performance outcomes. In other words, how do you create a culture-driven course? Well, the starting point is probably the backward design. Backward design, it is a method, an approach that will allow you to design units and curriculum and content in a very structured way. Traditionally, according to traditional methods, we used to start the planning of the units, the planning of the curriculum with the content. Backward design starts backwards. There are 3 stages: identify the result, the desired result, determine acceptable levels of evidence, and design activities that will make desired results happen. Now, the first stage focusing on what the student should be able to do or should know. What are the expectations that you have for the students? What are your outcomes, your goals, your objective for the course? It focuses on big ideas, on the framework. What are the principles that are going to support your teaching? The second phase, determine acceptable evidence, focuses on assessment, on what and how you will assess what the students have learned, on how you will determine that learning really occurred in your online virtual classroom. This phase focuses on the assessment task, on online APAs, tests, e-portfolios, projects. The last phase, designing activities that will make desired results happen, focusing on content and the strategies that you will have to adopt in order to develop in the students the desired skills. This phase focuses on resources, material, methods, sequencing of lesson, etc. Now, if we want to create culture-driven course, we want our students to be culturally competent. So what does it mean to be culturally competent? We need to define the concept of cultural competence. And this is where the ACTFL performance descriptors come in handy. According to these descriptors, being culturally competent, it is related on how the culture is reflected in the language. It is related to the ability of the students, of the learner, to use products, practicing, and perspectives to communicate in a cultural setting. The World Readiness Standards provide a even more detailed definition of cultural awareness, of cultural competence. The definition focuses on the idea of perspective, and this is going to be really the focus, very, very important for the planning of the course and the content and the units. Being cultural competence is being able to use the language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the relation between practicing and perspective, and again, products and perspectives. Now, let's see an example of reflection on products, practicing, and perspectives, and how this thinking can foster cultural competencies. In Japanese culture, there is a stronger sense of hierarchy. This is a perspective. This sense of hierarchy, it is based on age, social, professional status, degrees, education, etc. In Japanese culture, the exchange of business cards in this case, it is a product, is a key practice, a key behavior, a key ritual. Because cards function as a social markers of status, they must be treated with the highest respect, which means that you should not take notes, write down names or phone numbers on the business cards, which is a practice that it is accepted in American culture, for instance. Cards are also affect not only the practice, but they also affect the nonverbal and verbal communication. Nonverbal communication, because depending on the content of the business card, you will have to bow more deeply or less deeply to the other speaker. And verbal communication, because it will affect the choice of honorific titles, forms, depending on the status of the other speaker.
So when we're thinking about these things, as Marie described, when we're looking at how culture is verbal and nonverbal, and how when we teach culture through language or language through culture, we have to start then in this backward plan to start to determine acceptable evidence. And so the question becomes, how does assessment change when language and cultures are integrated in online courses? So we see here that we have to have meaningful and relevant use of the target language. We can also use culture as context and content, as well as for communication. As foreign language instructors, we're very, very lucky that we have all of these rich cultural resources. And so when we are teaching online, we can bring those into play and really engage students in meaningful conversation about cultures and having comparisons between the target cultures and their own through the target language, no matter their proficiency level. Some of these examples might be online portfolios that students are able to build over time. We might want to use those types of ICC can-do statements, and again, not as an assessment or a curriculum, but as a way to start a conversation about self-assessment and about language and culture learning. If we are having traditional exams, perhaps we want to contextualize them within the themes and the content of the unit or chapter or lesson, such that the student is looking at meaningful and relevant real-world experiences while they are being assessed. And we also can, if possible, connect with other disciplines to create IPAs that bring in knowledge from other courses as well. So we have a lot of different ways as online teachers that we can determine that acceptable evidence for our students. And it can be very, very exciting for them. At this point, they're on their way to passing from being just consumers of information to actively working with the target language, to talk about the target cultures, and to progress forward in their proficiency.
A couple of words about the three modes of communication. Three modes of communication are at the base of the IPAs, the Integrated Performance Assessment, and the IPA is a cluster of three real-world-like tasks, one for each mode of communication. All the three tasks must be assessed, and they are aligned with the main theme of the unit, and they reflect your daily teaching practices. Now, even if you do not adopt the IPA assessments, the three modes of communication are a very powerful tool that will help you to create activities and content units. So keep in mind the three ways of communication. Now, very briefly, interpersonal communication, it is the type of the communication that happens with negotiation. You need to negotiate the meaning. It is like an impromptu. Interpretive communication, it is the ability to interpret, to understand a reading, a video, an audio document. Presentational communication doesn't require negotiation. It is the type of task that I'm doing in this moment. I'm presenting something that I have prepared through these slides.
When we talk about determining acceptable evidence, we have to think outside the box for our online courses and as to how we're going to really integrate language and culture together. So on the left here, you have what is a more traditional assessment, fill in the blanks with the most logical vocabulary words, don't forget to use your articles. And it's not necessarily communicative. It doesn't mean that it's not good. Sometimes we need to work through examples like that with our class. But when we are really talking about evidence of learning as language and culture are integrated, we need to really think outside the box and think about how this notion of vocabulary is related to cultural ideas around the world. So this is one example that I have taught about about clothes, instead of using those blanks like that as an assessment, we talked about clothes and fashion in the Francophone world. So we're starting out here talking about Paris being the capital of the fashion world, and a little bit of the different kinds of terms that focus around clothing. And then where are you going to go to shop? Okay, are you going to go to a fashion show or a boutique, a flea market? So we get to then talk about also practices as well as products. And then we do move into a little bit of discussion of what each of these people are wearing. So as the slide would be animated when teaching, they wouldn't see the words and you could just practice with them, and then that would come up after they've answered as you practice whole class. And so you can see, yes, of course, we're doing some vocabulary instruction, but it's already been couched in language as culture and the products and practices. So we continue on, and then we can turn it to our students and personalize it. What would you wear when you are doing all of these things? And these are all vocabulary words that we've just come from learning as well. And then to go back out to sort of get back to the bottom of that iceberg, that about talking about core values and different influences, using language, the target language, to do that. Clothes, are they important? Okay, and so we're touching again on our students, what they think. Do you find clothing to be important? What do you wear when you go out with your friends on the weekend, when you go to class, and why? And then we can also have them tap into online resources, and in this case, Francophone cultures around the world, and answer some specific questions that guide them through their experiences in watching those videos. So they can work with a partner and look at these videos, and if we are giving them the ability to watch the videos with appropriate supports, with questions that demonstrate where they need to look or what they need to be looking for, then we're integrating authentic material in a relevant and meaningful way, but we're also giving them the scaffolding. So we are not editing the authentic materials, but we're giving them the support that they need to find the information that is targeted for the lesson. And in this particular course also, we had a movie sequence where students were asked to build a website regarding their thoughts about this movie through one of their compositions. So again, I brought it back out to the movies that we had been watching to talk about clothing in that aspect. So when we think about it in that different way, we are giving them, we're giving them a chance to really explore something online, to think about how it connects back to them, how it connects to the core values in the cultures that we're talking about. And we are getting that acceptable evidence.
Let's talk about now planning learning experiences and instructions. Let's talk about how to populate your course with content and activities. And I think that the ACTFL means to achieve global competence gives us a lot of guidelines. What does it mean to teach a culture? Well, to teach culture means to teach cultural diversity, multiple perspective. It means that our students have to recognize and value the diversity. They have to go beyond the surface, to go beyond the stereotypes about the cultures. And it means that you need to help them to examine cultural stereotype, diversities, and cultures and countries through the lenses of media or online resources. It means that you are going to have to create activities where the students collaborate, they share their ideas, they discuss the topics, they discuss perspective. And they, at the same time, they reflect on their own personal perspective, experiences, and culture. If I summarize the ACTFL guidelines, we can say that teaching culture is a teaching language. Teaching culture is a teaching content. Teaching language is teaching context. In other way, we need to teach culture as language, as content, and as context. What does it mean to teach culture as language? Well, culture is not a fifth skills. Culture is language. Language and culture are like the two faces of the same coin. According to the MLA report, we need to systematically encourage the students to reflect on the differences in meaning, mentality, and word view as expressed in American English and in the target language. What does it mean? It means that we need to integrate the language and the culture since the very beginning. We need to teach culture in the target language. We need to engage the students in authentic interaction. These interactions are in the target language, and they are authentic because we use authentic materials. We need to foster a reflective approach to language culture or lingua culture. And we need to explicit comparison, connections that enable the students to go beyond the stereotypes. And all this work has to be done in the target language. Now, when we're talking about authentic interactions, means that our content, our material, oral, written, visual, online resources, they have to be authentic. This is the first guiding principle. The second guiding principle is that when you choose your material, it has to be at level. You choose a reading that it is right for the novice level, for the intermediate level. Now, it is not always easy when you work with authentic material to find the perfect article, to find the perfect song that it is perfectly at the level for your students. This is where the concept of accuracy come in handy. The text has to be authentic, which means that you cannot edit the text. But what you can do in order to adjust and be able to use the text that you have chosen, even if it is a little bit beyond the level of your students, it is to edit the task. What does it mean to teach culture as content? Teaching culture as content, it means basically that you are going to adopt what it is called a content-based approach. Content-based teaches language through content. Traditionally, the word content referred to the grammar, the vocabulary, the pronunciation in language classes. In today's context, content has another meaning. Content means that language teachers, they use subject matter, biology, history, social science as a vehicle, as a mean to teach language, for language learning. So at the base of the content-based instruction, there is the idea of thematic unit. The thematic unit, it is a structure, contains different thematic lessons, but the starting point of a thematic unit, that by the way, it's going to be built up through the backward design, is an essential questions. What is an essential question? It is a questions, an inquiry that is going to guide all your content, all your theme, the focus it's going to be the focus of your unit, of your chapter, if you want. An example of thematic, essential question is the questions that you have here on the slide. For instance, why can't all young people go to school? Through this question, the students can, for instance, compare and contrast the value of education in the United States and in France, in the United States and in Italy. And they can also compare different socioeconomical background. So this is what culture as a content means. It means that the content is no more the vocabulary, is no more the pronunciation, is no more the grammar, but the content is a subject matter. In this case, the economy, the history, the value, cultural values. All this work is done in the target language. All the thinking, the deep thinking, the comparing and contrasting, it is done in the target language. Now, what does it mean that culture is also context, and you need to teach culture as context? Context as a different can be understood in different way, but as far as we are concerned today, culture is going to be the classroom. Why? Because culture, it is not only the knowledge about cultural norms and civilization about other countries, but culture, it is also the framework in which your students are working, in which you are working. The teachers, the students are part also of this cultural frame. And so this is where we bring in the personal reflection, where the students, they are going to compare and contrast other cultures, other lives with their own lives. They have to, where they communicate and interpret meanings, and they select possible actions to achieve goals. This means that we need to foster connection between and across classroom cultures in the target language. One last point, and this point has to do with the use of technology. When we use technology, we get usually very excited about technology, but there is no value in using the technology just for the sake of it. So as language instructor, we need to use technology with a purpose, which means that we need to ask, when we create a task, we need to ask, what is the additional value of this task? What is the technology doing, bringing in for us? If the technology, it is just simple substitution, maybe this task has to be, you need to rethink the task. The use of technology, the technology should redefine the task and the activity. What does it mean? Let's take a look to the next slide. Substitution, word processing. I can ask to my students, instead of writing a paper, handwrite a paper, to type the paper. There is no additional value on that, but I can create, thanks to the use of technology, a task, an assignment where the students, for instance, they have to design a travel brochure or a guide for a country, and they have to incorporate in the brochure hyperlink and embedded content. I can also go even higher and ask the students to incorporate multimedia and collaborate to include videos and student narration. I can ask the students to engage with technology, with another culture, through technology, by asking, for instance, to explore the location using Google Earth to promote the viability of the location as a tourist destination. I can ask the students to include in this activity, in this task, interviews with the residents, people who have visited the location, and data on social networking sites to validate the claims.
So as we are thinking through all of these opportunities that we have for our students online and how we can dive deeper and think about language as culture and context, take a moment to pause the video and go back to your self-reflection and think about what challenges you might face, whether that's language proficiency, student motivation, time, teaching materials, retention across levels, or anything else. And make sure that you make a note and start brainstorming about some ways that you could address these challenges in your courses. Okay, so piggybacking on to what Maria has said about giving technology a purposeful place in the classroom, we can talk about using Web 2.0 activities that can integrate language and culture. So we see a raise in interest, motivation, as well as ownership or agency from students, a feeling of freedom, and more critical thinking, because here we have this real world relevance. And we can talk about interdisciplinary connections, again, this content-based instruction, and we can really move from just cooperation to collaboration together to create new ideas. So we use Web 2.0, again, we're going back to this idea of you have a course foundation where we're creating conversations between learners and you're the facilitator. So this helps us to explore and extend and examine our products, practices, and perspectives using the target language such that we move from an online language classroom to a language community. And we see here some examples of different types of Web 2.0 options. There are a lot of them. We can have students respond to a blog, a class blog. We can use mashups like Google, we can use mashups like Glogster or VoiceThread to be able to present their ideas, and then they can comment on it as well to create a conversation between each other. And we also have podcasting or voice sharing applications that we can use. So we're really engaging our students in a meaningful way. So we just want to keep in mind that we have a safe environment. You maybe want to look for any .edu or education platforms for these Web 2.0 applications. They can provide a safe space for learners to publish on the web so they get that motivation, but they are still safe. And again, as Marie said, if something just looks cool, it might not be pedagogically effective. So we want to make sure that we're really thinking about how we integrate this into our classrooms. And how can you use the Web 2.0 tool to create conversations between online students in your specific courses? That depends on what your course is and the content and how you're integrating culture and language. So as we end up our lesson here, we just want you to take some more time for self-reflection, to revisit your notes, and to see what you've identified that could benefit from a stronger language culture interaction, and what kind of tools or frameworks you would like to explore. And then you also have, as part of this module, the Dig Deeper section with even more resources. So don't forget to connect with the DLSIG community to share your successes, your questions, or your ideas as well. Thank you very much for joining us in this module.